Well, it's time now for a look at this Monday's French newspapers with our press reviewer, Elena Casas. Hello, Elena.
Hello, Lorna.
Right, so what are we going to start off with today? What's the main front page story?
Well, it's Syria that makes the front page of Libération. Look at this front page. I couldn't fire on the crowd, it says. Now, Syria's correspondent has been meeting defected Syrian soldiers who've started what they call the Free Syrian Army based in Lebanon. They speak to a man who spent 29 years in Syria's secret intelligence service, who now says he carries a grenade with him at all times because he's so worried he might be caught. The Syrian army, of course, have carried out several incursions into Lebanon to try and get hold of these defecting soldiers. They also speak to people who actually participated in the repression in Syria before they defected. They say they were made to wear civilian clothes while they walked around the crowd firing on them to try and back up the regime's thesis that these are bandits or rebels that are causing the violence rather than soldiers. They also say there are Iranian soldiers fighting with them, something, of course, that Damascus completely denies that it's had any support from Iran. But that's what those soldiers say. They also say they're stockpiling weapons in preparation for an assault, saying they're going to carry out raids back across the border and attack the Syrian army. But the paper does point out, of course, that the small amount of military firepower they do have would be no match for the Syrian army.
OK, so that's in Libération. But Le Figaro also talking about Syria today.
Yeah, interestingly, they've interviewed Bashar al-Assad's uncle. We have a look at this interview. Now, he actually participated in repression, the paper says, during the 1980s, but he's now living in exile, and he tells his nephew the bloodshed must end. He also says the Arab League has no credibility within the Arab world anymore, and nothing they can do will encourage people close to Bashar al-Assad to defect. He says it's up to the UN, which is taken a bit more seriously, to do something to try and encourage them to defect. But he says whatever happens, the rule of the al-Assad family in Syria is over.
OK, now moving away from Syria, the Euro crisis still, of course, making headlines here in France too.
Yeah, look at this quite attention-grabbing front page at L'Humanité of gagged demonstrators. Their headline says, "The people have been gagged." They're talking about how those technocratic governments have been imposed in Greece and Italy. They say it's totally undemocratic because those governments are now going to force through austerity measures that the majority of Greeks and Italians certainly haven't voted for and they probably don't support. Now, L'Humanité, which is a communist paper, so you'd expect them not to be keen on austerity measures, uses really strong language for this. They call it a new colonialism and even totalitarianism.
But that's not a view that all the newspapers share.
No, Le Figaro, the right-wing paper, is of course much more keen on austerity measures. They've got Mario Monti, the anti-Berlusconi, on their front page, and they support him, but they say inside that he's got some huge challenges. They point out that the Italian people are far from convinced that the austerity measures he needs to push through are actually necessary, even though they might be pleased to get rid of Berlusconi. And he does say that the Cavaliere might not be out of Italy's political scene either, seeing as he controls so many of newspapers and TV channels. He's still quite able to create problems for a Monti government.
OK, now moving along a little bit more, the paper's also reporting on the Europeans who are suffering most from the crisis in the continent at the moment.
Yeah, specifically people dependent on food banks. If we have a look at this article in Le Parisien, they're talking about the EU being under pressure from Germany to scrap a scheme that gives public money to food banks that feed millions of people. Now, the French agriculture minister tells the paper the country will fulfil that subsidy if the EU doesn't. But this story is also in Libération, where they say the problem is even worse in Spain, where 1.3 million people have got no income at all, either from work or from state benefits, and queues for food banks are stretching around the block.
OK. And just quickly to finish, he's never far away from the headlines here in France, it seems. Dominique Strauss-Kahn hitting the front pages again.
The isolated Dominique Strauss-Kahn, that's Le Parisien's front page. This is the story of Dominique Strauss-Kahn and the text messages it turns out he sent to a CEO who's under investigation for bringing prostitutes to Washington to meet the then head of the IMF. The paper reports that he's increasingly isolated from his former allies, and even his wife, Anne Sinclair, they say, according to anonymous friends of the couple. This is totally unsubstantiated. She might have had enough, they say, and she wants to leave.
OK, well, we'll have to see what happens with that. But thank you very much indeed, Elena Casas, for that look at today's French newspapers.
Thank you.